Margaret stood at the kitchen window of her modest flat, watching the rain streak down the glass like tears she'd long ago forgotten how to cry. The envelope in her hand trembled slightly, not from age, though she was 63 now, but from the rage that had been building in her chest for the past 3 years. Inside the envelope was an invitation. Gold-embossed lettering on cream cardstock announced the christening of her first grandchild, a boy named Sebastian. At the bottom, in her daughter Emily's perfect calligraphy, were the words, "Your presence would be appreciated. Not we'd love to have you there. Not grandma, please come, just the cold." Formal courtesy one might extend to a distant acquaintance, Margaret set the invitation on the counter and returned to her laptop, where a spreadsheet glowed in the dimming afternoon light. She'd been working on it for months now, ever since she'd finally pulled herself out of the financial pit that Emily had left her in. The numbers told a story more honest than any words her daughter had ever spoken. 127,000, that's what Margaret had spent on Emily over 25 years. She tracked it all, every school fee, every music lesson, every university expense, every emergency that had required her mother to dip into savings, take out loans, work double shifts at the hospital where she'd been a nurse for 40 years. Margaret remembered the beginning, when Emily was just 3 years old and her father had walked out, leaving nothing but debt and broken promises. She remembered working nights, sleeping during Emily's school hours, living on toast and tea so her daughter could have fresh fruit and proper meals. "You're my investment," Margaret used to whisper, kissing Emily's forehead before rushing off to another shift. "You're going to have everything I never had." And Emily did have everything. Private school, where the other mothers drove Range Rovers and Margaret arrived in her 15-year-old Corolla. Piano lessons with a concert pianist. Summer camps in France and Spain. A master's degree from Cambridge. A wardrobe that cost more than Margaret's annual salary. A flat in London that Margaret had co-signed for, nearly destroying her credit when Emily forgot to pay rent for 3 months. Margaret had told herself it was love, that this was what mothers did, that one day Emily would understand the sacrifices and be grateful. The gratitude never came. Instead, there had been eye rolls when Margaret suggested Emily might visit more often. Impatient sighs when Margaret called to hear about her daughter's life. Cancelled plans and forgotten birthdays. And finally, the wedding, a lavish affair at a country estate that cost more than Margaret earned in 5 years, to which she'd contributed £10,000 she didn't have, only to be seated in the back row like a stranger, while Emily's new in-law sat at the head table. Alexander, Emily's husband, came from old money. The kind that whispered rather than shouted, that opened doors Margaret hadn't known existed. Within months of the marriage, Emily had transformed. She joined a tennis club, hired a personal stylist, began posting photographs on social media of holidays in the Maldives and dinner parties with minor celebrities. Margaret learned about these events the same way everyone else did, by scrolling through her phone, double-tapping on images of a life she'd funded but would never be invited to share. The calls became less frequent. Then they stopped altogether. For the first year after the wedding, Margaret made excuses. Emily was busy settling into married life. The new job was demanding. She'd call soon, but the silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional text message, "Can't talk now, at a function, super busy. Catch up soon, thanks." For the birthday money, the breaking point came on. Margaret's 60th birthday, she'd planned a small gathering, just a few colleagues from the hospital and her neighbor Patricia. She'd baked a cake herself, made sandwiches, bought a bottle of Prosecco she couldn't really afford. She'd texted Emily 2 weeks in advance, then again a week before, then the day of the party. Emily never responded. Never called. Never showed up. At midnight, after her guests had left and Patricia had helped clean up, Margaret sat alone with the untouched birthday cake and opened her laptop. She created the spreadsheet, and for the first time in her life, she began to calculate the cost of her love. The numbers were staggering. She'd remortgaged her house to pay for Emily's university fees. £45,000. She'd taken out personal loans for Emily's year abroad. £12,000. She'd covered rent, utilities, and living expenses during Emily's gap year, which turned into 2 years. £24,000. There were the driving lessons. The car she'd bought Emily, which Emily sold without telling her. The designer clothes for job interviews, the deposits for flats, the emergency dental work, the therapy sessions, the gym memberships, the weekend trips, the concert tickets, the restaurant bills. Margaret had given everything. And in return, she'd received a daughter who couldn't be bothered to show up for her 60th birthday. That night, something inside Margaret broke. Or perhaps it finally healed. She stopped calling Emily, stopped texting, stopped sending money. She blocked Emily's social media, closed her Instagram account, and focused on the only person who'd been neglected for decades, herself. The first year was hard. Margaret had spent so long defining herself as Emily's mother that she'd forgotten who Margaret was. She'd been the provider, the supporter, the safety net. But who was she without that role? She started therapy, not the expensive kind she'd paid for Emily, but sessions at a community centre with a young counsellor named Amir who asked difficult questions and didn't accept easy answers. Why do you think you needed Emily to need you? He asked during one session. Margaret had no answer. Or rather, she had too many answers, all of them painful. She'd needed to be needed because her own mother had been cold and distant. She'd needed to be the perfect mother because Emily's father had been the imperfect husband. She'd needed to prove that she could give her daughter a better life because her own life had been so hard. But in trying to give Emily everything, Margaret had taught her daughter the worst possible lesson, that mothers exist to be used. Love isn't supposed to bankrupt you, Amir said gently. Not financially and not emotionally. Margaret began to rebuild. She picked up extra shifts, not for Emily, but for herself. She paid off her debts, the credit cards maxed out from Emily's emergencies, the personal loans, the overdraft fees. She sold the house she'd bought as an investment for Emily's future and moved into a smaller flat that was entirely hers. She joined a book club, learned to play bridge, took a watercolor class and discovered she was terrible at it, but enjoyed it anyway. For the first time in decades, Margaret had money in her savings account. Not much. Her years of financial sacrifice had cost her dearly, but enough to feel secure. Enough to breathe. And then the invitation arrived. Margaret stared at it now, at the gold lettering and Emily's perfect handwriting. Your presence would be appreciated. She picked up her phone and, for the first time in 3 years, called her daughter. Emily answered on the 4th ring. Hello. Her voice was surprised, slightly wary. Hello, Emily, it's your mother. Oh, hi, Mum. I wasn't sure you'd gotten the invitation. I sent it weeks ago. I got it, Margaret said. Her voice was steady, calmer than she felt. I'm calling to tell you I won't be coming. There was a pause. What? Why not? It's your grandson's christening. My grandson, Margaret repeated. The baby I learned about on Facebook. The pregnancy you never told me about. The birth I found out about from Patricia, who saw Emily Ashworth Clark announce it in the Times. I was going to call when? Before or after his 18th birthday? Mum, that's not fair. You know how busy I've been. No, Margaret interrupted, and the word came out harder than she intended. No, Emily, I don't know. Because you don't tell me anything about your life. You haven't for years. That's ridiculous. We talk, we don't talk. You text me when you need money. You invite me to events where I'll be seated with strangers while your husband's family gets the family table. You post pictures of your life online and expect me to piece together what's happening with my own daughter from Instagram captions and Facebook photos. I'm sorry you feel that way. But I don't want your apologies, Margaret said. I want you to listen. Really listen, for once. The silence on the other end was profound. Margaret opened her laptop, pulling up the spreadsheet. Do you know how much money I've given you over the years? Mum, I don't think. £127,000. I calculated it. Every penny, every pence. School fees, music lessons, university, rent, emergencies, weddings, gifts. £127,000 that I didn't have, that I borrowed and scraped together and worked myself to exhaustion to provide. I never asked you to do that. You're right, Margaret said quietly. You never asked. You just expected. And I gave because that's what I thought love was. That's what I thought being a good mother meant. So what? You're saying I owe you money. You're going to send me a bill. No, Margaret's voice was firm. I'm saying that I gave you everything, and you gave me nothing back. Not gratitude, not respect, not even basic consideration. I'm saying that for 3 years, you couldn't be bothered to call your mother, to visit, to include me in your life. I'm saying that I had to learn about my grandson from a newspaper announcement. You could have called me too. The phone works both ways. I did call. For years, I called. I texted. I showed up. I arranged visits that you cancelled. I sent gifts you never acknowledged. I invited you to my 60th birthday, and you couldn't even send a text message. So yes, Emily, I could have kept calling. I could have kept chasing you, kept begging for scraps of your attention. But I decided to stop setting myself on fire to keep you warm. The silence stretched out. Margaret could hear Emily breathing on the other end. Could almost picture her daughter's face, the one that looked so much like Margaret's had at 25. Before life had carved lines of worry and exhaustion into it. I'm sorry, Emily finally said, and her voice was small. I didn't realize. I didn't know you felt this way. How could you not know? How could you not see it? I thought you were fine. You seemed fine. You always seemed fine, because I had to be fine, Margaret said. Because you needed me to be fine. Because if I wasn't fine, if I admitted I was struggling or lonely or hurt, you might have to actually think about someone other than yourself for 5 minutes. That's not fair, isn't it? Margaret asked. Tell me, Emily, when was the last time you asked how I was doing? And really asked, really listened, instead of waiting for your turn to talk about yourself. The silence was answer enough. I love you, Margaret said, and she meant it, even though the words hurt to say. I will always love you. You're my daughter. But I'm done sacrificing myself for you. I'm done being the person you turn to when you need something and ignore when you don't. I'm done funding a life I'm not invited to be part of. So that's it. You're just cutting me off. You're abandoning your grandson? I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm setting boundaries. There's a difference. Margaret took a breath. If you want me in your life, in your real life, not just as an ATM or a person to show off at events, then you need to make an effort. You need to call, to visit, to treat me like I matter. Of course you matter. Then prove it. Not with invitations to events where I'm an afterthought. Not with texts asking for money or favors. Prove it by being my daughter. By being present. By giving a damn. Margaret could hear Emily crying now, soft sobs that might have broken her heart a year ago. But she'd learned something in her therapy sessions, something that Amir had repeated until it finally sank in. You can't love someone into loving you back. I have to go, Margaret said. Think about what I've said. And if you decide you want a real relationship with your mother, one where we both matter, where it's not all take and no give, then call me. But don't call me for money. Don't call me because you need something. Call me because you love me. She hung up before Emily could respond. Margaret set the phone down and returned to the window. The rain had stopped, and a pale sun was breaking through the clouds, casting everything in gold. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was racing. She felt terrified and exhilarated and utterly exhausted. But she also felt something else, something she hadn't felt in years. Free. 3 weeks passed. Margaret kept herself busy. She signed up for a weekend watercolor workshop in the Cotswolds. She had dinner with Patricia and her husband. She bought herself a new coat, not an expensive one, but one she'd admired in a shop window for months and never allowed herself to purchase. She didn't think about Emily, or rather, she tried not to. Some habits were harder to break than others. On a Thursday evening, as Margaret was preparing dinner, her doorbell rang. She opened it to find Emily standing on her doorstep, holding a sleeping baby in a carrier. Her daughter looked different, smaller somehow. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore no makeup, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. "Hi, Mum," Emily said quietly. Margaret didn't move. "Hello, Emily, can I come in?" For a moment, Margaret considered saying no, considered closing the door on this daughter who'd caused her so much pain, who'd taken and given nothing back, but she'd never been able to close doors on Emily. That was part of the problem. She stepped aside. Emily entered, carefully maneuvering the baby carrier through the narrow hallway. In the kitchen, she set it gently on the table and turned to face her mother. "I've been thinking," Emily said, "about what you said. About everything." Margaret waited. "You were right. About all of it." Emily's voice broke. "I used you. I took everything you gave and never thought about what it cost you. I treated you like a resource, not a person. Not my mother." "Why?" Margaret asked. It was the question that had haunted her for 3 years. "Why was it so easy for you to shut me out?" Emily sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. "Because you made it easy. Because you were always there, always giving, no matter what I did. I knew I could ignore you for months and you'd still answer when I called. I knew I could treat you terribly and you'd still send money. I knew I could forget your birthday and you'd still remember mine. So you did. So I did." Emily wiped her eyes. "And then you stopped. And suddenly I realized I didn't know anything about your life. I didn't know what you did for fun, who your friends were, whether you were happy or sad or angry. I realized I'd been so caught up in my own life that I'd completely forgotten you had won too." Margaret sat down across from her daughter. "Why now? Why come now?" Emily looked at the sleeping baby. "Because of him, Sebastian. He's 3 weeks old, and already I love him so much it terrifies me. I would do anything for him. Give him anything." She looked up at Margaret. "And I realized that's how you felt about me. And I treated that love like garbage." "Emily, no, let me finish." Emily took a shaky breath. "I want to do better. I want to be better. I want Sebastian to have a grandmother who's part of his life. Not because I need a babysitter or money or help, but because you're amazing and he deserves to know you. And I want to know you too. The real you, not just Mum who gives me things." Margaret felt something crack in her chest. Something that had been frozen for so long she'd forgotten it could thaw. "I'm going to make mistakes," Emily continued. "I'm probably going to screw this up sometimes. But I want to try. Really try. If you'll let me." Margaret looked at her daughter, this woman she'd raised, who'd hurt her so deeply, who was finally trying to see her. "I need you to understand something," Margaret said carefully. "I meant what I said. I won't go back to being your safety net. I won't bankrupt myself for you. I won't accept being treated like an afterthought. I know, and I need more than words. I need action. I need you to show up, to call, to visit, to treat me with the respect and consideration you'd give any person you claim to love. I will." Emily reached across the table, taking her mother's hand. "I promise I will." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. "Then yes, we can try." Emily broke down then, really crying, and Margaret moved around the table to hold her. She smelled different expensive shampoo and baby powder, but underneath, she still smelled like Emily, like the little girl who used to climb into Margaret's bed during thunderstorms, like the teenager who'd cried on her shoulder after her first heartbreak, like her daughter. The baby stirred in his carrier, making soft mewling sounds. Emily pulled away, wiping her eyes. "Would you like to hold him?" she asked. Margaret looked at the tiny creature, at his miniature fists and the wisp of dark hair peeking from under his hat. "I'd love to," she said. As Emily lifted Sebastian from the carrier and placed him in Margaret's arms. Something shifted in the room. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. Forgiveness would take time, would require Emily to prove that this change was real and lasting. But it was possibility, a chance, a beginning. Sebastian opened his eyes dark blue, like all babies, and seemed to look directly at Margaret. Double quotes. "Hello, Sebastian," she whispered. "I'm your grandmother." Emily sat beside her mother, watching. "I'm sorry it took me so long to see you, Mum, really see you." "I'm sorry too," Margaret said. "Sorry I taught you that love meant accepting whatever scraps someone threw your way. Sorry I didn't set boundaries sooner. We both made mistakes." "Yes," Margaret agreed. "But we can learn from them." They sat together in the fading afternoon light, 3 generations in a small kitchen. And Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Repairing a relationship this broken never was. There would be setbacks and disappointments, moments when old patterns threatened to resurface. But for the first time, Margaret wasn't carrying the weight alone. For the first time, her daughter was trying, and sometimes, trying is where love begins. Margaret looked down at her grandson, at this new life full of infinite possibility, and smiled. "Welcome to the family, Sebastian," she whispered. "We're complicated and messy and far from perfect. But we're trying. And maybe that's enough." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds completely, flooding the kitchen with golden light. It was enough.